Well, good morning, church family. So great to see everyone this morning. I hope you're having a great morning. I've said morning 3 times already. Just looking for another word. Couldn't find it. Hey, we are in our study of the book of James, and I love the book of James. And I really do, because James challenges us to be people who put our faith into practice. James challenges us to be people who put our faith into action. James reminds us, pushes us that following Jesus is more than, bigger than simply believing true things about God. It's important to believe true things about God, but following Jesus takes us further than that. Following Jesus means allowing the gospel, the message of Jesus, the scriptures, inform and transform every area of life. How we think, how we live, how we love, how we judge people and circumstances, how we value our resources, the plans that we make. All of these different areas of life and many others should be impacted by the message of Jesus. And an area that must be impacted, must be affected by the gospel, the message of Jesus, is how we face and how we relate to suffering. Because suffering is something that is common to all of us. Suffering, tragedy, heartache, difficulty, pain, all of those things are common for us all. Welcome to church. There it is. No, but it's true. And I was trying to think of and part of the reason, and that's true, and we kind of know that's true, right? But oftentimes we live as if we expect something different. And I was trying to think of like an analogy to help us process and understand kind of that reality in our life, and I came up with one, and I'm going to share it with you. This is not a perfect analogy. In fact, don't push it too far, or it'll fall over. And maybe you can come up with a better one, and if so, I definitely want to hear it. But this is kind of the analogy that I came up with. It's kind of like living in a house that's on fire. I know. I mean, that's a little dark, And it's like trying to make your home, trying to live inside of a house, and all around you, the house is on fire. And it's like, well, what about the smoke? You couldn't live. I know, don't push it too far. It's like it doesn't, The point is, no matter how careful you are, no matter how many precautions you take, gosh, at some point, you're going to get burned. Our world is sort of like that. We live in a world that is broken because of sin. And we live in a world where pain and heartache and suffering are commonplace. And it's like no matter how careful you are, no matter how many precautions you take, at some point, pain and suffering and tragedy and heartache and difficulty are coming our way. It's part of the human experience. It's like, sort of like, kind of like, don't push it too far, but it's sort of like trying to make your home in a house that is on fire. No matter how careful you are, no matter how many precautions you take, at some point, you're going to get burned. And so, again, it's just nothing but sunshine and rainbows. All right, it's all good news. But if that's the case, right? If it's like, hey, we need to look at life with our eyes wide open, right? We live in a world that is broken because of sin, where all of these things are a reality, and many of us are walking through difficulty right now, and some of us can point back to our story and say, here's where I've seen it, and for some of us, it's in front of us, and we have no idea what's coming. I mean, I get all of that. So it's like knowing all of that. How do we move forward? How do we make progress? This is what James talks to us about today. This is what James walks us through. And it's almost like we need someone to help us lift our heads and look around and get a bigger picture and get a bigger vision. Because here's the reality. When we're in pain, like we tend to get tunnel vision. And that makes sense, right? It's like when we're in pain, that's all we can focus on. It's kind of like the nature of pain, right? It's like if I broke my leg right now, and one of you is kind enough to drive me to the ER, right? While we're driving, if you tried to talk to me about brunch plans, it's like, I don't want to hear it. It's like, I'm kind of working on something right now. I'm kind of focused. I got this going on, and I'm focused on that. And that tends to be how we react when we're in pain. It can feel all-consuming. It can feel like the only thing. And it's like we need somebody to come and help us look up and look around and get a bigger vision. And that's what James does for us this morning. So that's enough introduction. Let's grab our Bibles. Let's open up to James chapter 5 and let's dig into this because I think this is important and powerful and helpful for all of us. We're going to be in James chapter 5 this morning, starting in verse 7. It's page 1291 if you are using the seatback Bibles in front of you. And we're going to see here that what James is about to say to us is connected to what he said last week. And let's start at verse 7. We'll read verses 7 and 8 and we'll see that. And he says, in verse 7, he says, "Be patient, therefore," and therefore is your clue, by the way. "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." Now, what James is saying here to us is connected to what we looked at last week. It's connected to what he previously said. And our clue is in verse 7. It's the word therefore. He says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord." So in verses 1 through 6 in chapter 5, we talked about this last week. This is James kind of railing at the wealthy who love their wealth, and their love of money has pushed them to do bad things. And so they've been dishonest in their business practices. They've hurt people. They've caused pain. And so James gives this message kind of judgment, but in so many ways, it's a message of hope to the folks who are suffering. Because we see that in verse 6. So he gives this message of judgment, and then he says, then it's like he turns his attention, from the oppressor to the oppressed. He turns his attention from the perpetrator to the victim, and he says, therefore, or be patient, therefore, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. James reminds the believers that, listen, even though you are suffering right now, even though life is difficult, be patient and wait, because there is a day coming when Jesus will return. And when Jesus returns, he will bring justice with him. When Jesus returns, he will take all of the things that are wrong and he will set them right. And when Jesus returns, he will bring goodness and justice and peace, and he will remove sorrow and suffering and all of those things. He reminds the believers to wait for that day. Wait patiently for that day, because in that day, when we are finally united with Jesus, when we're finally with him, that is our future. That's our glorious future. When we're united with Jesus, that's when pain and suffering and sorrow end, and that's where our joy is made complete. And James gives these believers a vision for that day, and he challenges them to wait patiently for it. And then he gives them an illustration. He says it's kind of like farming. I think we talked about this last week or the week before. I am an expert farmer. Guys, listen, I literally know everything about farming. So, no, I'm just kidding. I've never even been on a farm, I don't think. But he uses agriculture as an illustration. He says, it's kind of like a farmer, right? That the farmer goes out and he plants the seeds, and then he waits patiently for that day when the seeds will grow and there will be a harvest. He waits for the early rains and he waits for the latter rains. And while he's waiting, I guess he does all of the things that you're supposed to do, fertilizing and tilling. Is that a thing? That's a word. I've heard that word, right, in conjunction. Tilling, yeah. All that stuff, all that great stuff that you do. And he waits for that. And James uses this as an example of what it's like to wait for that day when the Lord returns, to wait for that day when we will finally be with Jesus and everything is going to be amazing. And he challenges us to wait patiently like the farmer waits. It would be ridiculous if you heard the story of a farmer who went out one day and he planted all the seed and he sowed all his fields and he watered them and he did whatever it is that you're supposed to do. And then he goes home. And then the next day he comes out and he's frustrated that there's no fruit to harvest. That farmer would be ridiculous, right? Because the farmer, and he wouldn't do that because the farmer understands that he's in a season of planting. He's not in a season of harvest. Does that make sense? But many of us, and this is true, and listen, and how could we not do this? Right? This is why we need God's word to help give us a bigger vision. But we live like maybe that farmer. Like we look around at our life and we expect everything to be good all the time, and we're surprised when it's not, and we expect all of our problems to be solved. And listen, maybe they will be, okay? God is certainly at work today in our world and in your lives for good. And does God solve problems? Yes. Does God show up? Yes. Does God do incredible things? Yes. But you need to understand, we're not in a season of harvest. That day has not come yet. That day when we're finally united with Christ and there is no pain and no suffering and no sorrow and no hardship. To quote, I've been trying to think of a quote outside of this, but I love the show The Chosen so much. And to quote The Chosen, in this world, bones will still break. Hearts will still break. And that's true. That's what's going on in our world. Okay, I've talked too much about this. I need to move on. But here's the idea. James tells the farmers, listen, remember, there is coming a day when Jesus is going to return. There is coming a day when all the wrongs will be set right. And if you know Jesus, your future's secure. There's coming a day when you're going to be with him and everything is going to be good. So James would say, because of Jesus, your future is glorious. So wait patiently. Because of Jesus, because of what God has done for you in Christ, your salvation is secure, and there's coming a day when you're going to be with Jesus and every wrong will be made right and it will be better than good. Your future is secure and glorious. So in light of that, wait patiently. Even in pain, even in heartache, even in suffering. Because suffering will not win the day. So James challenges us to wait patiently. And then he talks about how we should wait, or what should be true of us while we're waiting. Look at what he says next. In verse 9, he says, do not grumble. What a great word. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. James talks to these believers who are going through something difficult, and he says, listen, you need to wait patiently, but while you're waiting, you need to live graciously. Don't grumble against your brothers and sisters. Don't be rude or unkind or difficult. Live graciously. Because of Jesus, your future will be glorious. So wait patiently. And while you wait, because it matters to God how you wait, while you wait, live graciously. James continues. Now he's going to give them some examples, some pictures of what it looks like to wait patiently. And so he gives two. Let's see the first one. Lost my page. The first one he gives is in verse 10. He says, as an example of suffering, brothers, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. So the first example that James gives of what does it mean, what does it look like to wait patiently, he says, well, look at all of the Old Testament prophets. Look at all the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures. Look at their lives as examples of waiting patiently. And I love that because they're great examples, I think for two reasons. One, many of the prophets suffered in life as a result of serving the Lord. Many of them had to say difficult things to people who did not want to hear it. And as a result, many of the prophets suffered as a result of the message that they shared. But I think it's even bigger than that. And I think it's better than that for as an example to us, because almost all of the prophets, many of them proclaimed promises from God that they would never see. Many of them proclaimed promises from God that would be fulfilled years after they were gone. And yet in the middle of that, they didn't give up. They were faithful. They were faithful to God, and they continued to proclaim and trust and hang on to God's promises, even though many of them knew that these promises, they wouldn't live to see them fulfilled. And James says, let the prophets be an example of what it means to live and to wait patiently. In our lives, listen, it is possible that you might live your whole life and not see every promise of God fulfilled in your lifetime. But here's the reality. When you are standing in front of Jesus and you see him face to face, every promise will be fulfilled. And this is good news. Because of Jesus, your future will be glorious. So wait patiently. And while you wait, live graciously. He gives one more example. Verse 11, he says, behold, consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. James holds up Job as another example, and maybe you're familiar with the story of Job, and I love the story of Job for this reason. In Job, we see someone who suffered a great deal, and yet he continued to trust God. He continued to remain faithful. But the reason I think that Job is such a good example for us, those are all reasons why he's a good example for us. But one of the things that means so much to me is in Job, when you read Job right at the beginning, it's like the author pulls back the curtain of heaven, and we get to go behind the scenes and see what's going on. So right from the beginning, we understand why Job is going through what he's going through. We have some background. We know what's happening. Job never gets that. Job suffers, and he seeks the Lord, and God shows up and is so faithful to him and helps Job kind of see a bigger picture, and Job trusts in the Lord, and God, for no other reason than because he is kind and he's good, he blesses Job, and he gives Job tenfold what he had lost, and children and all of that, and God is good to Job, but Job never gets an answer. Job never finds out why he had to suffer. Job never found out the answer to his why questions. Why is this happening to me? Heaven is silent. We get to know the answer, right? It's like we get to see what's going on, that there's something going on. But Job never gets that answer. And yet, Job remains faithful to the Lord. It's possible, listen. When we suffer, when we go through pain, one of the first questions that we tend to ask is why? Why is this happening? Did I do something wrong? Did I mess up? God, are you trying to teach me? You know, what's happening? Why am I walking through this? And the reality is, you might get an answer to that. Sometimes we do, right? Sometimes the answers come in retrospect, right? It's like, hey, I went through this, I went through this thing, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but when I look back, I see how God was at work and, what he was doing. I've seen the way God's brought good out of this. Sometimes we get an answer, but sometimes we don't. And you may live your whole life and never get an answer to the question, why is this happening? But you should know. You may not get an answer to the question this side of heaven. Why is this happening? But listen, when you see Jesus face to face, it's not going to matter. Everything's going to be all right. The truth is, from some of us, it may not be okay until we see Jesus face to face. But when we see Jesus face to face, it's going to be okay. It really is. Because of Jesus, your future is glorious and secure, and no one can take it patiently. And while you wait, live graciously. Now the next verse is tricky. The next verse is a little tricky, and we're going to read it, and then we'll talk about why it's a little tricky, and then we'll talk about why maybe it's not so tricky. Verse 12, let's read this together. But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. What's tricky about these verses is it's not explicitly clear where these verses fit thematically in the passage. It's not explicitly clear thematically if James is intending for the verses that we're reading to be connected to what we just read. There's no therefore right in front of it. So it's not clear if these are meant to be connected to what we just read or if they're meant to stand alone. But in these verses, we see James echoing Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. Right? We've talked about this throughout the series, that James in his writing was heavily influenced. He was influenced by Hebrew wisdom literature. We get all of these wonderful wisdom speeches kind of throughout James. And James was heavily influenced by the teaching of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount. And all throughout James, we keep seeing James echoing back to Jesus' teaching in that sermon. And that's what he does right here. And so I want us to flip back and look at what Jesus says about this in the Sermon on the Mount. So this is Matthew chapter 5. We're going to be looking at verses 33 through 37. I think that's on page 1030 in the seatback Bibles. If you want to flip there, but if not, I can just read it to you and you can just listen. Here we go. So Jesus said again, and so listen and hear the similarities. You can hear James echoing Jesus. Again, you've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So in this passage, in the Sermon on the Mount, and in the teaching of James, James and Jesus make a very simple point, and it's this: be a person of integrity. Right? That's it. Be a person of integrity. Be someone whose word can be relied on. whose word can be trusted. Don't be the kind of person that makes people chase you around for promises. It's like, I know you said yes, but I don't know if I can trust what you said. So do you promise? You promise? You promise? Don't be that kind of person. Be the kind of person that when you say yes, you mean it and you do it. And when you say no, you mean it and you do that too. The point is, be a person of integrity. That's the point. It's the point of James, it's the point of Jesus. Now, if we were to try to answer the question, is this passage meant to stand alone or is it connected? I tend to think that it's connected. And I think it's just simple. I think the connection is simple. I think James is making the point that, listen, even in suffering, even when you're in difficulty, be a person of integrity. Be somebody, be a man, be a woman of integrity. Even when it's painful. Even when life is hard. Because oftentimes, isn't it when we're in difficulty, when we're in pain, when things are difficult, where we're often most tempted to sacrifice our integrity, to kind of get out of this a little bit, like the pressure's on, the heat is on, right? It's like there's some, I don't know the expression, but there's some expression like, it's like when the heat is on, that's when we see who we really are. It's something like that. Yeah, I can't think of, there's a clever way to say it and I don't have it. But that's the idea. And I think the point that James is making, listen, is how you wait, it matters. So I would say it like this. Because of Jesus, your future will be glorious. So wait patiently. And while you wait, live graciously. Don't grumble. Don't complain. Don't be a jerk. Don't be mean to people because you're suffering or, even when life is difficult. Be a person of integrity. One of the ways that we live graciously is we tell people the truth. Is we know that we're the kind of person that can be counted on, that can be relied on. I think that's the connection that James is making here. That James is challenging us, remind us, even when life is difficult, even when we're waiting patiently for that day, be people of graciousness and integrity. I think that's the point. So, I want to try to help us move a little bit in that direction because it's like, well, that's a nice thing to say, but is there anything I can do to help me have that mindset more often? And so I want to suggest two things to help us live more patiently as we wait for the glorious day, the returning of the Lord, when everything will be made right, our glorious future. I want to suggest two things to help us live patiently and two things to help us live graciously, okay? So number one, I wrote these down and I want to get it just right because these are a little, this is kind of a wordy sentence, okay? So I'm going to try to say it slowly and you're all smarter than me, so you'll get it immediately. Okay, so number one, how do we live more patiently? Develop the discipline, because it is a discipline, develop the discipline of reflecting on the reality of eternity with Christ and how glorious that will be. I'll say it one more time. Develop the discipline of reflecting on the reality of eternity with Christ and how glorious that will be. In other words, make it a habit to think about your future with Jesus. Make it a habit. Develop the discipline, because it is a discipline. It's one of those things, you might need to schedule it. Like, this is my time, my 15 minutes where I'm just going to think about it, But make it a point to reflect on your future with Jesus and how glorious it will be. Because oftentimes we don't think about that, especially when we're in the middle of pain and difficulty and hardship. It's like that's all we can think about. It's like, but we need to remember that we have a future in front of us that is better than anything we can imagine. That is better than the best life we could carve out for ourselves here on earth. There is a future in front of us that will be glorious. So take time to think about that. And then the second thing, so there are two sides of the same coin, okay? So take time to think about your future with Jesus. Maybe you need to take 10 minutes a day where I'm just going to think about eternity. I'm going to think about heaven. I'm going to think about the amazingness of heaven. And by the way, what makes heaven heaven is not streets of gold. What makes heaven heaven is the fact that Jesus is there and we will be with him. So take time to think about that. So that's one. Think about your reality, your future with Jesus. And then secondly, make the decision, because it's a decision. Make the decision to view all of the circumstances in your life, the good and the bad, through the lens of, or in the light of, eternity. You see, it's two sides of the same coin, right? Spend time thinking about your glorious future with Jesus. And then make the choice, because it's a choice. Make the choice to view all of the circumstances in your life through the lens of your glorious future with Jesus. So put it, and what that does is it helps you put things into perspective. And as you do that, as you take the time to reflect on your future with Jesus, as you take the time to decide that I'm going to view all of my life through the lens of eternity, then more and more you will find yourself being able to, like the writers of the New Testament say, these light, momentary afflictions pale in comparison to the glory that will be revealed in us. Can you imagine having such a view of eternity that when you think about the hardest things you walk through in this life, that you could view them as light, momentary afflictions? That's what an eternal perspective does for us. It's so important. So think about, take time, develop the habit of thinking, reflecting about your future with Jesus. And then make the decision to view all of your life through the lens, through the light, in the light of eternity. That's how we wait patiently. Now, let's talk about some ways to help us live graciously. While we wait, live graciously. Okay. I just want to suggest a couple things. And maybe they're two sides of the same coin as well, but let me read this to you. Don't use your pain as an excuse for a lack of graciousness. Don't do it. Don't use your pain as an excuse for a lack of graciousness. Because oftentimes, that is when we are tempted the most, right? To be mean, to be hurtful, to be unkind, to grumble. It's like, well, look, it's again, we go back to my broken leg and you're driving me to the hospital and then you're not thinking, you're trying to talk to me about brunch, and what do? I snap at you. Right? It's like, I'm not listening to that right now. Or anyway. The Oscar goes to. Yeah. But that's the point. In those moments, it's when we're most tempted to not be gracious. So don't do that. Don't let your pain be an excuse for a lack of graciousness, because how we wait matters to God. While we wait, how's it go? Live graciously. Wait patiently, live graciously. That's how it is. Second thing. Do good, even when it's difficult. Even in your pain, even in your suffering, even in hard times, God may give you opportunities to do good and to bring good and kindness and light into situations. So when those opportunities arise, take them. While you wait, live graciously. Don't use your pain as an excuse for a lack of graciousness, and do good even when it's difficult. And I think, when I think about that, it could be, right, that our graciousness, even in difficulty, that our willingness to be patient, even in suffering, that our willingness to do good, even when it's difficult, it might be the most powerful witness for the gospel that we have. That it's like, even when life is hard, I am looking I'm looking to something. And even when life is hard, I'm not going to use that as an excuse to be hard on you. And I'm going to look to do good and to bring good into the world. I think that might be one of the most powerful witnesses for Jesus that we have. So let's be people who recognize that because of Jesus, your future, my future, your future, it will be glorious, and it is secure. It is safe. No one's taken it from you. So wait patiently. And while you wait, live graciously.